An Afghan couple accused a U.S. Marine of abducting their child. And after a years long court battle, that U.S. couple's adoption has officially been voided. The girl in question is now 6 years old, and she still has not been returned to live with her original family. This story from the AP has not received a lot of attention despite how shocking it is. Amidst everything else that is going on in the news right now, a lot of attention has yet to be paid to this shocking story from the AP. The Associated Press began reporting on this story in 2022 with this headline that reads, Afghan couple accuse U.S. Marine of abducting their baby. This reporting is from AP reporters Juliet Linderman, Claire Galafaro, and Martha Mendoza. And it goes to show what having a well resourced newsroom that isn't dependent on clicks and viral attention can do. Because over the past few years, they were able to chase this story, uncover extensive documentation, and unveil a really shocking tale. The story starts in 2019 when a US raid in Afghanistan left the parents of this child dead, along with many of her siblings. In the rubble after the raid, US soldiers found this infant girl with severe injuries and took her to a military hospital where she began recovering. At that point, she went to live with a cousin and his wife. But in the meantime, a US Marine had taken a particular interest in this child. He's a lawyer named Joshua Mast, and he and his wife, who are both evangelical Christians, set out on a years long mission to adopt this little girl. When the AP first reported on this in 2022, the girl was 3.5 years old at that time, and the Afghan couple who had raised her were ensnared in this legal battle on US soil with Joshua Mast and his wife. For context, the AP's 2022 report notes that originally from Florida, Joshua Mast had married Stephanie, his wife, and attended Liberty University, an evangelical Christian college. He graduated in 2008 and got his law degree there in 2014. Fast forward 5 years, and the couple were living in a rural Virginia town with 3 children of their own. Joshua Mast was sent on a temporary assignment to Afghanistan, where he was a military lawyer. The AP reports that September in 2019 was one of the deadliest months of the entire US occupation in Afghanistan, with more than 110 civilians killed in the first week alone. Now, the context of this particular US raid on September 6, 2019 is disputed. Joshua Mast pushes the narrative that the US was attempting to capture a terrorist, and that when they arrived, the man detonated a suicide vest and killed many of the surrounding people, including 5 of his 6 children, minus this baby girl. The attorneys for the Afghan couple who were related to this baby girl dispute this account entirely. They say that her family were farmers who were killed by the US military. But both sides agree that when the dust cleared and this 2 month old was pulled from the rubble, she was badly injured and taken to a US military hospital to recover. Once the infant was in the hospital under the care of the US Department of Defense, 2 things started happening. Joshua Mast began aggressively petitioning to adopt this child, appealing to then US officials, including then Vice President Mike Pence. At the same time, the AP reported that the International Committee of the Red Cross began searching for the infant's family. Now, this cultural context is pretty important. The AP reports that the American concept of adoption doesn't even exist in Afghanistan. Under Islamic law, a child's bloodline cannot be severed and their heritage is sacred. Instead of adoption, a guardianship system called kafala allows Muslims to take in orphans and raise them as family without relinquishing the child's name or bloodline. This is part of the reason why it is so rare for Americans to adopt children from Afghanistan. It's only supposed to be possible for Muslim American families of Afghan descent. And the State Department only recognizes 14 American adoptions from Afghanistan over the past decade, with none in the past 2 years. So, already the circumstances around this planned adoption were incredibly unusual, and they countered Afghan cultural ideals around who should be raising their children. This wasn't a Muslim American family looking to take in a child from their shared heritage. It was an evangelical Christian couple who already had children of their own who had taken an interest in this baby. The baby was placed with a couple who are believed to be her biological cousin and his wife. They began caring for her, but at the exact same time, Joshua Mast was working to adopt her himself. Joshua and Stephanie enlisted the help of a translator who was an Afghan Christian who had moved to the US. This man considered it his Christian duty to help the Masts, testifying that he believed it would be a great picture to see a terrorist's daughter become a believer and glorify God's name. The timeline and balance of power throughout this situation is very tricky and convoluted. Essentially, the US government took the position that the Masts were not able to legally adopt this girl, take her out of Afghanistan, or take her from her family. But Joshua Mast was able to work with other officials, sometimes within the very same agencies, to nonetheless chart a path to being able to adopt this child. As we know, he was ultimately successful, and the tale of how he actually obtained the child is shocking and horrifying to read. A few days ago, the AP published the results of their years-long investigation, including numerous documents that they were able to uncover detailing the process through the courts. These thousands of documents show that Joshua Mast was dishonest in dealing with the US government and the court system. He claimed that the child was already his dependent, despite her not being in his custody. At one point, he claimed that she was already living in the US when she was not. And he relied on the messy withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan at the beginning of Joe Biden's term as president in order to sort of sneak this through. A judge in Virginia ultimately granted the adoption, but bypassed multiple safeguards to get there. And a separate judge ultimately reversed that adoption, voiding it entirely. But the girl, who is now 6 years old, has not been returned to live with her Afghan parents. Instead, she's still living with the Masts, and no court in the US has so far compelled them to hand her over. The case is currently in a legal limbo, and the Trump administration, which initially denied the Masts the ability to adopt the child, may very well reverse course and allow them to continue to raise her. This is a picture of Joshua and Stephanie Mast outside a courtroom in 2023. I'm going to read this section from the AP article that details exactly what happened that allowed the Masts to take physical custody of this child in the US. It involved bringing the Afghan couple who was raising the girl to the US under the pretense that she would be receiving further medical care. But the Masts' real intention was to then physically take the child from them once they arrived. So, reading this excerpt from the AP, it says, military officials asked no further questions, and soon the family was on a plane to Germany, where the Masts met them for the first time. The Afghans testified they had no idea the Masts planned to take her. The Masts have said they tried to explain that they would. Stephanie Mast testified that when she and her husband arrived in Germany, they, quote, knew we had to speak to them and just tell them the truth. She tried to explain, quote, sacrificial love. If the baby came with them, she told the Afghan woman, she can have the best life possible. The Afghan man ripped off the wristband refugees wore and threatened to return to Afghanistan if the Americans tried to take the child. The Afghan woman later said they convinced her that she'd misunderstood and persuaded them to continue to the US and keep the baby with them. The Afghans boarded a plane bound for Dulles International Airport, then a bus to Fort Pickett, a military base in Virginia turned makeshift refugee center. Meanwhile, the records show Mast asked a State Department official he'd met in Germany to help connect him with other government contacts so he could track the family's arrival. Emails show employees with multiple government agencies sprang into action, including the State Department. The federal government would later say that these employees, like the military officials who evacuated the family, didn't know that the very agency they worked for had tried to prevent Mast from taking the girl. Rhonda Slusher, a State Department official, answered the phone at Fort Pickett. On the line was Joshua Mast. He said he was going to come pick up his adoptive daughter, according to a declaration Slusher submitted in court. Slusher said she was told there was no U.S. jurisdiction to hold the child and she should be given to Mast at the earliest point possible. Her supervisor instructed her to assist with, quote, the transfer of the child, she wrote in the declaration. Mast told Slusher he was concerned the family she was being taken from were going to be sad, she wrote. On September 3rd, 2021, uniformed officers drove the Afghan family to a nondescript building near the camp's front gate. Slusher picked the baby up out of the car seat and insisted she hold her as the family went inside. There, the Afghan woman later testified. Another official, this one from the Department of Health and Human Services, told them, "You are not the parents of this child. It's like you are kidnapping her," the Afghan man said. The Afghan woman came toward Slusher. "Please give me my daughter," she said. "She is my daughter." The baby cried and squirmed to get back to her, but Slusher wouldn't let her go. The woman tried to grab the child, but Slusher pulled her hands away. The woman crumpled to the floor crying. She lay there for at least 5 minutes. Slusher wrote in a declaration that she carried the baby outside, where Stephanie Mast was waiting in the car. Stephanie Mast fed the girl goldfish crackers before they drove away with her husband. This is a quote from the Afghan couple's attorney. They said, "It is worth reiterating that this prolonged tragedy was entirely avoidable. The Trump administration blocked an attempt to unlawfully seize the child from her Afghan family in early 2020. The child and her relatives are victims of a crime and a tragedy no family should ever endure. A stark reminder that this withdrawal continues to have far reaching and devastating consequences." This anonymous couple is now living in the US, and they even have a baby's room decorated for this child's arrival if she ever gets there. But so far, she's continuing to live with the Masts. There's a section in the AP's previous article that says the Afghan woman plunged into a deep depression and, despite being 9 months pregnant, stopped eating and drinking. She could not sleep. Her husband was afraid to leave her alone. He told the AP, "Since we have come to America, we have not felt happiness for even one day. We feel like we are living in a dark jail." His wife gave birth to a girl on October 1st, 2021. But the young mother's grief became overwhelming. A month later, she considered suicide and was taken to a clinic. Meanwhile, at the exact same time, the Masts traveled to a Mennonite Christian assembly in Ohio to share their joy over obtaining this baby girl. A program for an event to celebrate this said, "Unforeseen events gave the couple an unexpected opportunity to stand up to protect innocent life. Come hear how God's mighty hand allowed for a remarkable deliverance." After fighting in court for years, in March 2023, the Mast's adoption was officially voided. But this story doesn't have a happy ending yet. Instead, despite the Virginia Court of Appeals upholding that decision, the case has gone before the Virginia Supreme Court. It has yet to issue a ruling, so the girl remains with Joshua Mast and his family. In October 2024, the Marine Corps held an administrative hearing to determine whether Mast had violated military rules. A 3-member panel found that he acted in a way that was unbecoming of an officer, but that didn't warrant suspension or any other formal punishment. The federal government has indicated in court in recent months that it is reconsidering its role in the case, and Trump's second administration could reverse his first administration's opinion that Mast had no right to this child. The Justice Department did not respond to AP's repeated requests to clarify its current position on that child's fate. It has been 4 years since the Afghan couple saw her, and in July, she turned 6. That's where this story ends for now, and it is truly horrifying to read. A few things that come to mind are the evangelical Christian position that this child should be brought up in a different religious faith than the one she was born into, and ideals of white supremacy that undoubtedly flow through that entire line of reasoning. Additionally, it goes to show that there is corruption and mismanagement throughout the entire federal US government, from agency officials contradicting each other, from certain officials accomplishing things of grave significance and consequence despite other official orders prohibiting them from doing so, as well as the decision not to punish Joshua Mast, despite us now knowing that he lied multiple times about this child in order to take custody of her. The last thing I want to do is read a few of the top comments on this article from AP readers, starting with this one. It says, so an evangelical Christian lied to gain custody, then lied to keep custody. Isn't lying to the courts a crime? It's interesting that MAGA justifies the awful treatment of immigrants because they view them as criminals. Yet Mast justifies breaking the law because, in his view, it's in the best interest of the child. I just wish evangelicals, most of whom are MAGA, would explain when following the law supersedes following Jesus, because I think they're confused. The next comment says, it's obvious the little girl should go back to her Afghani parents. It makes zero difference that she might be better off with a different set of parents. That has never been a valid reason to take a child. Imagine if a court took a child away from poor parents and gave it to wealthy parents because they could provide for it better. And it's also worth noting that there's no evidence that this child is better off with the masks or that they are better equipped to take care of this child. And finally, this comment says, here again, Americans taking the children of another nation without consent, riddled with lies about the procedures. How did this military officer get away with just being reprimanded? Modern day trafficking, you killed the parents, branded them terrorists, and took their children to indoctrinate them with propaganda. America unveiled. With everything going on in the news, it's easy to let stories like this one slip by, but I do hope that people will pay attention. It exposes a very dark truth about the way America's systems are working, and the question I'm left with is whether they are actually working as intended.